what we're going to do in this session is two main things. Firstly, I'm going to talk a bit more about the bigger picture of your novel, the real big expanse and the way that emotion links to that broad story that you're trying to tell. And then secondly, we're going to hone in right on the very, very detailed points of writing a novel, the real specifics of the language that you choose to put on the page. Let's start with the bigger picture. We talked a little bit in the last session about internal conflict. We talked about the idea of the character having a flaw that they need to get over to achieve their happy ever after, and that conflict being what drives some of their emotional reactions to the story. Another way of thinking about that is to think about it in terms of a character who wants two competing or two mutually exclusive things. So if you think about Mr. Darcy, again, last session we talked about his pride and the idea that he needs to overcome his pride in order to have the happy ever after that he wants with Lizzie. Another way of thinking about that is to say that Mr. Darcy wants two incompatible things. He wants to maintain his status and not lose face. He also wants Lizzie, and he can't have them both. He's going to have to compromise this to get this. So that's another way of thinking about it. But that conflict, whichever way you phrase or define it, is one of the things that drives your character's behaviour through the story, and your character's behaviour is what drives the story itself. And that's really keyed in really closely to their emotional state and their emotional reality, because all of their reactions are driven by those internal conflicting forces. So that allows you to think in those terms when you're structuring your story. I'm sure you've all, if you've got any distance at all in writing a novel, encountered the phenomena of the saggy middle, where you hit that midpoint of the book and you've just got a really long way to get to before your big climax and ending. And you might know what you want that climax and resolution to be, but you've got an awful lot of words to get through before you get to them. And it all gets a bit trudgy and a bit sloppy and a bit ill-defined, a little bit dull potentially. The novel with the saggy middle. Knowing your character's conflicts and your character's emotions is a really good way to help you shore up that saggy middle through that process that we talked about last week of thinking, what happens to them? How do they feel about it? And you know how they feel about it because you know who they are and what conflict they're trying to resolve inside themselves. And then taking it a little step further, how are they going to behave? And you know how they're going to behave because you know who they are as an individual. There's a really good piece of writing advice, which is one of the best pieces of writing advice I've ever been given. So I can't take credit for it. This was said to me by Sue Murcroft, who is a brilliant writer and writing tutor. And she said that if you're struggling with the saggy middle in a novel, you should always go deeper rather than wider. And what that means is that you need to go deeper into your character's emotion rather than wider into external plot events. So rather than thinking, oh God, something has to happen, I know, I'll blow up the building, you think, what's my character's conflict? How are they feeling? How are they going to react because of that feeling? And you find the events that are really going to push their individual buttons and bring out their emotional reactions. So you might think about a character, maybe you have a character who thinks they are undeserving. That's their flaw, that's their fundamental character flaw. They don't think they deserve to be happy, they don't think they deserve love, they don't think they deserve kudos and praise, and you might put them in a position where they're viewed as being a hero and see how they react to that, because that's going to play directly into their emotional conflict. So it's about making sure your story is laser focused to that individual character so that that emotional conflict that's playing out within them really comes out on the page. If your character's conflict is, say, a lack of self-confidence, writing a lot of scenes where they're not pushed out of their comfort zone isn't going to bring out that character's emotion. What's going to bring out that emotion is if you push them into situations that make them uncomfortable, that make them attempt things they didn't think they can do, or run or have to run away from the thing they don't think they can do. You have to push them into situations that are keyed into their specific emotional conflict and emotional reality. So understanding your characters, understanding what their character flaws are and what their competing wants are, their emotional conflict, is going to allow you to create story events that really focus in on those and give you the most opportunity to put emotion on the page. Which is my beautiful segue into the next part of this session, where we're going to look in a lot more detail and specifics at how you put that emotion on the page. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples, one of prose, narrative, and one of dialogue, and I'm going to give you my thoughts on each of these, but I'm also going to invite you to discuss these in the forums as well, because you might have quite different opinions and you might have quite different reactions to each of these as a reader. So first of all, we're going to look at a piece of prose dialogue. And this is two different ways of describing essentially the same emotional reaction. So number one, the sobs racked through Julie's body, making her whole being shake. She let the tears fall, sliding from standing to seated on the bottom stair and bending double, desperate to make herself small. And number two, Julie wept. So, on a kind of surface level, both of these are describing the same emotional event and the same emotional reaction, but obviously they're quite different, completely incomparable really, in terms of how the prose works and how we're expressing that. Now, some of you, I suspect, will look at that and go, oh, she's a creative writing teacher, so the long, wordy one that's telling us a lot of information must be wrong, and the short, stark one that just shows us it quickly and then moves on must be right. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't think there is a right and a wrong here. I think these are pieces of prose that work in different ways and are doing and achieving different things. So the first one, the longer one, invites the reader to come and kind of sit in Julie's emotion with her. You're spending some time there. It's a little bit, for some people's taste, overwritten possibly, but it is holding you in that emotion. It's not letting you move on and it's not letting you come out of it. Now, if you had a whole chapter or a whole series of chapters that were written in this style with this emotional intensity and this level of description, it would start to become quite wearing, I think, for the reader. The flip side of that, Julie wept. Straight to the point, very stark, and it has a kind of arresting sort of moment there. Julie wept, full stop. I can picture this being the whole paragraph. Could even be the whole chapter. That's absolutely fine. I've never written a chapter that short, but I have written a chapter that was half a page, so it's totally fine. But definitely I can picture this being a paragraph on its own with that bit of white space around it. You're saying one thing, you're saying it very clearly. It has a slight shock value to it if it's just telling you one thing very baldly. Again, if the whole book was written in that style, it would become quite tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat, and that in itself could become quite boring. What you probably want over the course of a novel is variety, and you need to decide, as an author, what impact am I going for here? Do I want something very stark and very arresting and very... Or do I want something where I kind of pull the reader in and invite them to sort of sit in the emotion and really experience that over a longer period? Neither is right or wrong. You will have personal preferences. And if you have a really strong personal preference, that might tell you something about your voice as an author. And I don't think you should ever try and write against your own voice. If you have a strong natural style, embrace that, but be aware of it, and be aware occasionally that there might be moments that you could go in a different direction and strengthen your voice over the whole of the course of the book just by giving a little bit more variety. Here's our second set of examples that we're going to think about, and this time we're going to think about dialogue and how we present that. So, number one. Why did you do that? He asked angrily. Number 2. Why on earth did you do that? He asked. 3. Why the did you do that? He asked. Number 4, why did you do that? He yelled. Number 5, why did you do that? He whispered, digging his fingers into her arm and pulling her away from her friends. So, we've got essentially, with very slight variation, the same line of dialogue there. We've made a couple of changes to the wording on number 2 and number 3, but the question is essentially the same question throughout. And we're looking at different ways that you could couch that and what messages that would give to the reader. So the first one, we end with the dreaded adverb. Now, I have nothing against an adverb. Anyone who tells you you must never use an adverb needs to just stop and have a good hard think about what they've said. An adverb here and there is absolutely fine, as any other form of language is absolutely fine here and there. I suggest that with dialogue, if you feel like you need an adverb to tell us how it's being said, go back and have a look at the line itself and see if you can strengthen it. Now, you might not be able to. There might be circumstances where the line has to be that way because it's a motif you've used elsewhere in the book, or because it's very specific to the character, but you're aware that it is open to interpretation. In that case, an adverb might be appropriate, but most of the time for dialogue, I would say, if you have to tell us how something is being said, review the line itself and see if you can make it more evocative of the emotion. So the next two do that by saying, why on earth did you do that, or why did you do that? We're putting a bit more emotion into the line. Those are different choices and they say something different about the character. There's a general rule that certainly in commercial fiction you should only swear if it really, really needs it. In real life, when I'm not being teacher Alison, I swear like a docker, and I really try not to in books. I end up taking a lot of F words out when I edit, because I know that they will jar with some readers. Some readers won't be bothered at all, but they will jar with some readers. And for those readers, it can be enough to pull them out of the whole book. And we don't really want that if it's avoidable. So generally, as a rule of thumb, if you need your character to swear, be really disciplined and say, is there another way I can do this? If there really isn't, fair enough. But use it sparingly because it will just jar hugely for some readers. The flip side of that, though, is that there are some characters who would never say, why on earth did you do that? They would definitely say, did you do that? So you need to make sure that you're not putting language into a character's mouth that makes no sense at all. If you're doing that, it might be better to stick with, why did you do that? And then find a way of making the emotion clear in the way that you couch the dialogue. So maybe he shouts it. Why did you do that? He yelled. Has more of an emotional punch, has more of a sense of anger because we know that he's shouting. And then the fifth example is slightly different. So he whispered doesn't necessarily give us anger, but when we read the rest of the line, I think this comes across probably the most angry of the lot, but it's a different sort of anger. This isn't someone losing their temper. This is someone controlling their anger. They're not going to make a scene in front of her friends, but at the same time, he's digging his fingers into her arm and pulling her away from her friends. So that has not a sense of anger in the sense of someone losing their rag in the heat of the moment, but it has an anger of someone's controlling their rage, which I think is quite sinister and quite threatening. So you can take the same line and fundamentally the same emotion at headline level, anger, and how you express it and how you couch it can give quite different messages about the sort of anger. So why did you do that? Or why did you do that? He yelled would suggest someone losing their temper. It would suggest a kind of heat of the moment, whereas someone whispering an angry question gives a very different feeling. So when you think about writing dialogue, you're thinking about not only the words that the person is saying, you're thinking about how they're saying them. You're thinking about what actions they're doing alongside them to give the really specific emotion that you're looking for there. Again, I'd be really interested to hear what you thought of those examples and how you responded to those as readers in the forums.